In 1990, the U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife listed the northern spotted owl as threatened, causing logging restrictions and job losses. This sparked the Timber Wars, a conflict over the responsibilities of protecting owls and old-growth forests versus job rights. In response, Bill Clinton championed the Northwest Forest Plan, which, despite criticism, was the best long-term solution for saving old-growth forests and spotted owls possible at the time. The old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest are renowned for their beauty and age. Old-growth forests are evergreen stands that have grown for hundreds of years. The tallest trees in the world, like the redwood, cedar, sequoia, and Douglas fir, reside in these forests. They provide a vital habitat for many unique species. One is the northern spotted owl. Named for the dappled white spots on its plumage, this rare bird is found in the western Pacific Northwest. The spotted owl prefers old-growth forests to establish their nests. This preference made them especially vulnerable to habitat disturbance by logging. From the 80s to the 90s, the northern spotted owl went from practically unheard of to the figurehead of a giant environmental protest. In the early 20th century, the focus of the timber industry shifted to the Pacific Northwest forests as a lumber source. World War I and II construction efforts in growing towns and cities drastically increased the national demand for timber. Back then, old-growth forests were viewed as wasteful because they didn't grow timber fast enough. Scientists thought that because of their age, old-growth forests were decaying and not even animals wanted to live in them. In contrast, densely packed timber plantations consisting of only one kind of tree produced more lumber per harvest and would continuously provide future harvests. It was the dawn of an age when trees became a mass-produced crop. At the time, there was little scientific analysis of old-growth forests, and most research was on logging trees instead of learning from them. However, in the 1970s, there was a flood of scientific research on the benefits of old-growth stands. A scientist named Jerry Franklin published a paper on the characteristics of old-growth Douglas fir forests. His work showed that old-growth forests are full of life in some of the world's most complex ecosystems. Replacing them with planted stands destroys this biodiversity. At the rate the timber industry was going, all the remaining old growth would be gone in 40 years. This revelation started the protest that would soon consume the entire Pacific Northwest and change many lives forever. The problem with protecting the old growth was that you had to attack the timber industry, and environmentalists didn't have much legal ground to do so. The first attempts in court were unsuccessful because the timber industry was backed by the federal government. The way forward was not to protect the trees themselves, but an animal dependent on the trees through the Endangered Species Act. Derived to prevent the extinction of native species, the act, enacted by Richard Nixon, allowed species to be placed under the category of threatened or endangered. A listed species qualified for special protections of its habitat. The spotted owl, soon to make it onto that list, was first comprehensively studied in the 70s by Eric Forsman, a young scientist who showed that spotted owls were vulnerable to the excessive cutting of old-growth forests. Due to this research, the spotted owl was listed as threatened by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife in 1975. However, this listing didn't protect the owl the way environmentalists had hoped, but in 1986, environmentalists filed a petition that was received by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to list the spotted owl as threatened on a federal level. In 1987, after reviewing the petition, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service declined to list the owl as threatened, but received backlash and resistance.
It was extremely intense. People on the timber industry side, the families that were supported by the timber industry, were seeing a threat to the supply of logs to local lawmills, local timber harvesters, and on the environmental side, the cutting of old growth timber stands, which was the habitat of the northern spotted owl and other threatened species. They were passionate in protecting what old growth forests were left after decades of cutting timber.
Soon after these protests, on June 23, 1990, the spotted owl was federally listed as a threatened species. Although this was a major win for the environmentalists, the Fish and Wildlife Service decided to permit logging until a long-term plan was made. The George H.W. Bush administration couldn't craft a plan that conserved the spotted owl and preserved the timber harvest. These issues became pivotal in the 1993 election. Although incumbent Bush prioritized the logging industry over the owl, Democratic candidate Bill Clinton pledged a compromise between both.
Consider this. We spend $100 million of tax dollars a year subsidizing the exports of raw logs, but this administration has opposed spending $100 million to give people incentives to modify the mills, to use second growth.
Furthermore, he promised that if elected, he would hold a timber summit to find a solution.
For workers in the Pacific Northwest to start new industry, they've been against all that.
When Clinton defeated Bush, immediately after his inauguration in January, his team began planning the summit, also known as the Forest Conference. The Forest Conference was held on April 2, 1993 at the Oregon Convention Center in Portland. During his introduction, President Clinton addressed the need to recognize the importance of both sides of the conflict and find a balance between them.
Clinton brokered what he thought would be a compromise between economic values in terms of wood products and environmental values. And he thought that he could balance those things in such a way as that you could continue to earn a living from the woods, but you also can do so in a way that maintains enough habitat for the northern spotted owl.
Throughout the day, stakeholders, scientists, environmentalists, and logging representatives shared their perspectives and offered new ideas.
One of my heroes said, ecosystems are not only more complex than we think, they're more complex than we can think.
If we don't reinstate some federal timber sale program this year, our industry is going to be forced to lay off thousands of workers.
The decline of our forest's health must be dealt with at its source. Cutting practices must be reformed.
It became clear that the controversy was much bigger than the spotted owl versus the timber industry. It was the problem of balancing human rights and humanity's responsibility to preserve natural environments. At the end of the conference, President Clinton announced that his administration would develop a plan to preserve and protect the federal forests in 2 months, the Northwest Forest Plan.
I intend to direct the Cabinet and the entire administration to begin work immediately to craft a balanced, a comprehensive, a long-term policy. And I will direct the Cabinet to report back to me within 60 days to have a plan to end this stalemate.
The Clinton administration assembled a task force to develop the plan. This team was the Forest Ecosystem Management Assessment Team, or FEMAT. The plan's basis was to ensure the survival of species like the spotted owl and salmon while producing at least 1 billion board feet of wood. This new plan split the national forests into categories that would put them into federal reserves or leave them for logging. About 4/5 of the old growth remaining would be protected. The plan promised slightly over 1 billion board feet of wood. The Northwest Forest Plan was born. In the end, the Northwest Forest Plan preserved much of the biodiverse old-growth forests. Old-growth forests have been free of sustained yield forestry since, protecting the species living there and marking a historical shift in forest management practices. Although logging is no longer the main threat to old-growth forests, the northern spotted owl has yet to recover. Its primary threat is the invasive barred owl, which has migrated west and is outcompeting it. In response, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has controversially proposed killing hundreds of thousands of barred owls, but the spotted owl's future remains uncertain despite protections. The protests, research developments, and journey of the northern spotted owl controversy led to new ways of thinking about conservation, old-growth forests, and their ecosystems. Although having an economic impact on the Pacific Northwest, it preserved much of the old-growth forests and spotted owls. The northern spotted owl controversy was a true battle of rights and responsibilities. Through the hardships of debate and loss, it paved a way for future environmental practices and changed our outlook on forest management.